government, Yale B. Opening opposition, Oxford C. Closing government, Princeton A. And closing opposition, UCD LNH A.
Your rubbish is terrified! Hashtags on fire! Your rubbish is terrified!
Calm down now. My name's Lucy and I'm the chair of the panel. I'm joined on the panel today by Ashish, Dan, Franny and Archie. Just a reminder to the audience, please keep your phones off or on silent, and I know you want to support your teams, but please try to keep table tapping and all that stuff to a minimum. The thing that will persuade us most that they should go through is their speeches. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome the Prime Minister to speak to the motion. Hear, hear.
Opening government, we stand for a revolution in politics. Without anger, we'd be stuck in an unacceptable status quo that privileges moneyed powers who have stayed there for far too long. Only anger can break this, can break the inertia that has shackled too many people into poverty. Well, we think our model is fairly straightforward. We support greater use of arguments that rely on pathos rather than logos. Maybe prefer the populist over the technocrat. We prefer Bernie Sanders over Hillary Clinton. We support, to be clear, emotional arguments, but not to the point of violence. Again, Bernie Sanders style, not Hillary Clinton style. We will advance you a few arguments. Thanks for laughing. Okay, cool. We think the conception of objectivity is a myth. It's not objective at all, because the facts have always and historically been controlled by the elite. This is because when you do things like rely on statistics and stats, marginalized groups, for example, are often not counted by the census. Moreover, the conception of what we consider to be an objective good is often very much historically conditioned to be something that is good. For example, certain values seen as objective, like as, for example, more money is being created, is often, which has been historically privileged, no thank you, is seen as objective, whereas more softer things like, say, mental safety, when we do things like a safety debate, safe space debate, is seen as subjective. So when people come up with arguments saying, what you said enormously offended me, or something that's really bad, this is seen as, say, non-objective and should be discounted politics, which is often the way by which people who have historically excluded, that is, they do not have much money, or for example, do not have historically as access to levers and creation of knowledge, have historically made their arguments. Moreover, aggregate statistics, or things considered by the objectiveness and dispassionateness, exclude asymmetric impacts to different groups. That is, if certain groups are heard dramatically more than others, or certain groups are relying more on one thing than the other, it's very difficult to articulate the need to this to those who do not experience those things unless you use anger. That is, people, it's very hard for them to internalize how impacts to other people manifest unless you appeal to their baser instincts. This is why you rely and say, oh, there's an X drop in dollars for certain groups. People are largely unpersuaded by it. When you couch in terms of human impact, people can meaningfully understand it. This is why we think the best way by which the conception of objectivity is ultimately self-defeating. Yeah.
Surely we can talk about objective human impact. We don't need to be angry in doing so.
So, disagree. There are some things. That's a little dispassionate way to disagree, but there are certain things by which you can factually state it, but the dominant norm in politics we think is perfectly acceptable to be anger. We're not saying, oh, literally never use a number in your life, but we say, when Bernie Sanders go up there, when we're trying to nominate who the next Democratic nominee is, we want someone who's a firebrand, we want a Sherrod Brown, we don't want a technocrat who plugs away on some spreadsheets and finds the best policies, a universal basic income. We want people talking about human dignity and why this is essential. The second thing we want to talk about, how is it impossible to break the existing structures of power without anger. This is true for a couple reasons. Number one, mass mobilization is necessary to change the structures of power. The problem with things like protests and getting people out to vote is there's a collective action problem. The cost of, say, taking time off work or going to protest is privatized or internalized, as you yourself are the one missing work, but the benefits of doing so are socialized across everyone else. This is why it's very hard, even if they have an interest in going out and protesting or an interest in going out and voting, it's very hard to induce people to do so. Why does anger in politics get more people to do so? One is increases the incentive to do so because you just dramatically heighten the stakes, so even if it's a socialized benefit, there's a lot more of a positive benefit. But secondly, it increases their sense of community when they go out and protest because they're unified not by a certain number or a dispassionate thing, but by a sense of there's a grievous injustice, they need to do so. On their side of the house, it is very difficult to stack rallies, people really fighting for change. On our side, there is. Secondly, we think there exists a natural inertia. That is, there are enormous amounts of bureaucratic checks or certain veto points that exist in pretty much every government around the world that makes dramatic change necessary to, say, dismantle the structure of mass incarceration nearly impossible or very slow. It's a lot easier to be apathetic about the fact that, say, there's massive gender imbalance in debate, or the fact that, say, there's a massive racial divide in places like South Africa and the United States that have not changed in decades. But unless you feel that the stakes are enormously heightened, that is, you weaponize anger, you create an incentive why it's no longer acceptable to stay home. Even if you know, everyone knows things about vegetarianism, everyone knows it's the right thing to do, but people make dispassionate arguments. When people say that this is truly, oh, it is the right thing to do, I see that skeptical look. But if you really ripped up and say, look how angry you are about the grievous need, people are far more likely to do it. It's a lot easier to be apathetic. But finally, we think it mobilizes previously ignored groups. Populists like Bernie Sanders brought in an enormous number of new, particularly young people, into vote. This is because marginalized groups feel that the status quo has ignored them. Dispassionate objectivity makes politics seem like it is for the elite, or people who have, say, really like ritzy degrees, or can speak the language of the bureaucrats. When you speak to people's basic instincts, because the way that people actually engage with politics and feel it is through their gut instincts, their human impacts, they're far more likely to show up because they feel that it is speaking to them. This is why, say, voter turnout with populists is far dramatically higher than when it's an election between two different technocrats. People don't know all the exact facts, but they do have a gut instinct that politics finally recognizing it is far more likely to actually help them. Closing you if you want.
So you say anger is the voice of the minority. Who is currently the person in public discourse using anger the most to get their message across? And do they have a gold bathroom?
Sure. Why is it the case that anger in politics is far more likely to protect the minorities in the political system writ large? This is because in the status quo, some people do use anger, and that anger is used asymmetrically, often through race mechanisms like racial resentment. The marginal change in our side house, when you actually embrace it as a norm, is that, say, the elites or other people believe that this is an appropriate tool to counter it. So instead of saying Michelle Obama's when they go low, we go high, do Eric Holder's when they go low, we kick them. This is to say that the marginal change of having a general discourse that says it's acceptable is no longer do individual small subsections use it, rather to generalize norms so you fight fire with fire and no longer, say, cede the emotional impact to the Trumps of the world, and you allow actually to be able to fight these kinds of things. This is why we think it is far more likely that anger is going to be used as a tool to fight for justice as opposed to otherwise. Moreover, if Trump no longer has a monopoly on speaking for the difficulties of, say, having a white-collar existence or formerly living in a factory town, now the factories now have left, now is the case that you can actually fight them on. This is why Richard Ojeda in places like West Virginia were far more competitive than Hillary Clinton was in West Virginia and fighting things. He actually spoke to people who think the marginal change of embracing anger as a norm is far more likely to be successful in fighting this. We also think it is far more likely to lead to policy. That's because dispassionate objectivity doesn't convince people, because people with different ideologies have different facts, right? There's a carbon tax and decreased jobs, or there's also no way to bridge between them, right? Oh, carbon tax decreases the number of jobs, it helps climate change. The ability to weigh between different facts is impossible. The way you weigh between them or convince them is by speaking to their basic instincts, and more importantly, just literally mobilizing more people on your side. We think numerically there are far more people who are willing to fight for justice, because that is fight for everyone, and if we have more people participating in politics, more are fighting it, it's more likely to happen. I want to leave you with some way. Why do we need massive structural reform? Why is the status quo so unacceptable? This is because, for example, 2 billion people live under $1 a day. They live paycheck to paycheck, or not even paychecks. They don't get paychecks, and their certainty in the future is so low. Racial gaps in wealth have barely changed in decades, places like the U.S. and South Africa. The idea that we could just stick to what we have done previously is a fallacy. It is worth trying and failing if it gives us a chance to dismantle a system that systematically ignored and excluded and destroyed the livelihoods of so many billions of people. Super proud to stand for anchor.
I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for that speech and welcome the opposition leaders to begin the case for opposition. Hear, hear.
problems in the last speech. First, they overlook who in the status quo uses anger. What we told you is that the norms which are built up by the generation of facts which they want to hang their hat on their side of the house are themselves norms which disproportionately keep the disempowered out from using this as a means to air their grievances. That is to say, in the status quo, you see things like white men being more able to sacrifice social status by rejecting norms of respectability politics and things like that far to a greater degree than those who are actually vulnerable in society are able to. Because when it's a person who is currently in power breaking norms of respectability politics, they are made so much less vulnerable than someone who's actually vulnerable to getting attacked, who's actually vulnerable to economic harms on the day-to-day. And what this means is that when they talk about anger creating bad negotiations, they talk about anger shutting down discourse, the status quo is a circumstance in which anger is used to shut down discourse when it is preferenced or when it is better for those in power and that anger is actually targeted at. Because the reality is people should be more angry about global poverty. People should be more angry about the fact that white people, even though they're a vast minority of the population in South Africa, own the overwhelming majority of the wealth. This sort of thing is what people should be angry at, but in the status quo, only those who don't have anything to lose are able to be angry about it. But more importantly, they miss the second thing, which is what's actually needed in politics right now. Because what Will told you, and what I wish we got an engagement on, is that what ends up happening right now is people misconstrue politics as being about getting people to turn to your side and getting fence sitters to shift to believe your opinion. The reality we would posit, which is validated by the fact that populists turn so many more people out in elections, sorry for the American examples in the first speech, is the fact that you don't need people to turn from the fence, you need people to see that the things they hold dear to them on an intuitive and emotional level are seen. Note, when they talk about bringing forward videos of starving Americans or something like that, the reason this is a silly example is because what vibe are you going to go for when you're showing a video like this, other than anger? Are you going to hold it up and in a monotonic, dispassionate voice of empirical, observation, be like, this is really upsetting, we need to deal with this? No, if they're angry about it, people are going to get angry at themselves because they are not having their problems heard, or people are going to reject politics as a whole, which is what I'm going to speak about quite a bit more in this speech. So this is why we can't have slower politics. Slower politics forces out the people who cannot be angry in the status quo. You need to normalize it on all sides. Note also, when they talk about polarization, they overlook a third thing, which is to say the fact that the facts used in dispassionate conversations, which they need to defend, are disproportionately facts which shut out the most vulnerable in society. Another thing I wish they'd engage with. The reality and the challenge I want to level on them is whether or not they can ever instantiate an example of a social movement which has been able to achieve structural change through the use of dispassionate objectivity, rather than weaponizing the unheard anger of people being structurally oppressed in the status quo. Great. All that said, I'm going to talk about elitism and the politics of dispassionate objectivity, then protecting minorities and the vulnerable, then anger and mobilization. Before that, actually, I have a single piece of rebuttal outstanding. They told you that anger leads to uncomfortable discussions. The question you need to ask is uncomfortable right now for who? The problem is that on their side of the house, in dispassionate objectivity, the people who are angry are not the people who actually have problems to bear. We would tell you that the people who need to be in conversations about things like sexual assault are people who actually understand what it's like, and are people who can actually empathize with those who have been assaulted. Rather, we do not need them to enter into these discussions thinking they're going to enter a sanitized discussion of this, using statistics about assault, rather than actual discussion of what the terrible experiences are and what is the problem in the status quo. Let's talk about elitism and the actual politics. What we told you about objectivity and the facts which undergird it is the fact that they're engendered by the elite. These are things like elite universities, elite institutions, and think tanks, these sort of things. Importantly also, the inability to break gridlocks based on facts, which is another thing they need to contend with, because ultimately what happens in a world of objective dispassionate objectivity is that each side presents facts as to why something is or is not a problem, and it's impossible to ascertain which facts are more important. This is something which is fundamentally difficult to resolve, and the impact of it is very severe, at the point which what happens to those who are actually affected by the issue. Let's say structural poverty in an empirical conversation about UBI is they see the eggheads in the political system talking about the statistics and not actually discussing whether or not they think it's a problem. Because they say anger drives you away from reaching structural change. We would tell you that reliance on facts drives you away from why it's a problem in the first place, which is what shuts people who who actually have the most meaningful voices to discuss the issues out of the conversation. The people who are in the best position to adjudicate what the solution is are the people who are harmed in the status quo. Their side is least likely to concentrate towards them. Oh, and also, when they talk about who we shut out, and they specify people like the wealthy and the powerful, the problem with this is that they are stakeholders who are going to be involved on both sides of the house. The marginal change is that the people who are most affected by problems do not feel like the problems are cared about on an emotional, angry level to validate the upset and the anger which those people who are victimized feel themselves. Those people need to be in a conversation politically. That is the simple weighing we would posit, to the point which maybe they get slower solutions, but they don't get the right solutions because you cannot ascertain what the meaningful solution to a problem is unless the people who are victimized are discussing it. Before I discuss protecting the vulnerable and then mobilization, I'll take a closer.
So you say minorities, powerful people feel attacked when minorities can use anger, right? But presumably this uncomfortableness, harm is symmetrical because migrants in America also feel embarrassed or attacked when Donald Trump uses violence in language against them.
So two things to say there. First, they said that people feel upset when people are angry at them. But more importantly, those migrants get victimized by anger in the status quo by the very argument we gave you. However, it is passé, it is not okay for them to be the ones getting angry back because it looks like they're avoiding respectability politics, which they themselves are less capable of doing it. What we told you then, in terms of protecting minorities, is that it's far harder for them to use anger back. And we would tell you they're the ones who are most necessary to do it. When they speak about men shouting the loudest, being the ones who get their way, that is the status quo. And it is far harder in a world which does not normalize anger in the political arena for people to respond to it with anger of their own. Because ultimately we would tell you the emotional resonance of anger will win out when one person actually has something to be angry about. Let's talk finally about mobilization, because I think this has been very much obvious throughout my speech. Ultimately, the people who are necessary to mobilize are the people who are suffering, people who can speak to what the problem is and what they themselves, because they should be given agency in this instance, want to be the solution. In a world in which they view conversations with the problem which affects them as sanitized, dispassionate objectivity, which again, the next speaker needs to defend more thoroughly, they do not enter the conversation at all. Moderates don't really turn out to rallies. The people who do are the people who actually think their problems are cared about and are heard. That's why we brought you on opening government. That's why we're proud of
I'd like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that speech and welcome the Deputy Opposition Leader to continue the case for opposition.
Opening government's biggest misconception, obviously, is to conflate a sense of anger that people feel with the use of anger in public discourse. What I want to demonstrate coming from OO is very simple. You can still use emotive language. You can still use language that riles up people's emotions by saying, look, there are people who are starving, and I think we can care about those individuals. The question then is, how should you articulate your response to this emotive language or emotive sense, right? You can easily be angry in response to this and shout, oh look, starvation is a huge problem, we need to deal with that. Or you can come to an objective solution and try to find a way in which you can reach compromise. The question is not about whether or not we should feel angry, because I think it is true that there are many things you should feel angry about. The question is, in response to this feeling of anger, how should you articulate your discourse? In light of this, I'm going to talk about two things. The first thing I want to discuss is the idea of inclusiveness. The second thing I want to talk about is the idea of effectiveness. Before that, like, if they really want us to give examples, like, I'll give plenty, like the Gerald March, for example, which moved from the northeast of England downwards, saw an increase in welfare spending without the huge anger that's necessary for any kind of violent protest that happens in reality. Like, just please don't say we don't have enough examples. I think we do everything that we want us to. So, on the idea of inclusiveness, I think Rachel brings to you three arguments with very little response coming from their side. I'm going to follow all of them. The first idea is the likelihood of effects, right? The idea is fairly simple. When you're angry, the likelihood that you think about what you're going to say is diminished. And that means that it happens a lot in debate, you're likely to make people feel less comfortable because you're more likely to offend them. You're likely to attack them personally because you feel that their lived experiences is less important than yours, and that is why you're feeling angry. I think this leads to further harms, which I think is substantively adding on to stuff that Rachel brings to the table. The first is that it leads to far greater demonization. The reason is because it's far easier to paint someone else as the guilty party rather than some fact or some theory. And that means you're more likely to pick up a group of individuals and say they are to blame. And that's why it's very easy, for example, for Donald Trump to say immigrants should be blamed for our economic problems, rather than discussing really what are the economic solutions that are needed in order to create revitalization. The demonization has two consequential effects. The first is not only that it leads to worse compromise, because less people come to the table. The second is that in and of itself, this process of demonization, I think, is harmful to people who are vulnerable, to people who have been oppressed in the past. To be insulted, I think, is just something that we shouldn't let them go through since they have been demonized before, and I think they should do it. Okay. The second thing I want to talk about is how this leads to an increased likelihood of violence as well. And I think it's slightly simple. I don't think Gov can fear out the fact that violence might happen on their side. I think it is true that they don't need to support the use of violence, but the likelihood of violence increases to the point in which anger is a main mechanism by which you engage in discourse. When people are riled up, heated in emotions, it's very easy to throw a punch without thinking, right? That's why their own language of when they go low, we kick them, sounds fairly violent, because the response is likely to be something that is coming from inside of them, right? A physical need to fight back, rather than having or thinking it through objectively. So again, Rachel brings to the table, once again, no response, just that the environment is less comfortable. When people are screaming at you, maybe as someone who has suffered a huge traumatic event in the past, you don't want to be sitting in a vicinity of people who are just screaming past you, trying to say their own experiences is more important than other people, rather than considering the actual victims. I think it just leads to harms of not including these individuals in the discourse. The third thing that Rachel brings to the table is that it might not, individuals might not be able to rally their passion, and therefore they cannot join into a social cause. The important thing to note here is that on our side, both kinds of individuals are able to respond to social causes. People who believe in objectively assessing the facts and therefore recognize the value of a social cause will be able to come forward. People who are angry at the realities of the world, but also recognize at the same time that maybe the best way to convince individuals to shout in their face can also join our social cause. Whether or not you feel a violent or angry response to the social problem, I think you can join our side as well. The comparative though is that if you're not able to scream out loud, like if you're a vegan who doesn't feel you need to shout at someone who is not vegan in their face, then you won't be able to join those causes. The only claim that comes in response to this is an implicit response. That's the idea of apathy. The idea that people know the facts, but they aren't joining these movements because they're not angry enough or people are not winding them up. Like, okay, I'm not vegan. If a vegan came to me and shouted in my face, I will not be convinced. The reason I'm not vegan is because I don't want to be, rather than I'm just not angry enough to be. I think that shouting is just like the worst way to convince them, because I don't think it creates the kind of change in the logic of individuals who now are trying to find a way to justify why they don't believe in this social cause to begin with. These three things, Rachel brings to the table, no response regrettably coming from opening up, and I think we've already taken above them. The last thing they say under this idea of inclusiveness is that anger leads us to consider the human impact. I think what this leads us in comparative, as Rachel brings to the table, is that you consider the personal human impact of the person who is screaming. You're trying to justify your lived experiences. An attack on your logic is taken as an attack on your identity. And that is why that conflation means that while we do consider the human impact, we consider it to ourselves rather than objectivity, which forces us to engage with how others are affected. Maybe, possibly, and we will concede in a less visceral way. But if it means to consider the statistics of how it affects people outside of your neighborhood, outside of your community, I think that leads to a better outcome, and understanding that human impact is still possible on our side. What is this in light of the bench comparison? I think whatever closing opposition is likely to bring to a table, we're engaging with the most vulnerable of individuals who are not included in this discourse, and I think that likely is going to outweigh the bench. Before I move on, I'll take closing.
The reason for why minorities and other people cannot participate and use this anger is not because of some intrinsic feature of anger specifically, but just because there are norms about their general participation in politics. Whether you use objective discourse or anger does not change that.
No, I genuinely think that minorities are included in many social circles of discussion. People who are talking about it objectively, who are trying to find a safe space for minorities to come in and to talk about the issues. But if they were to engage in angry discussions, I think that minorities would feel excluded if they do not believe they can shout louder than other individuals in this discourse. Which leads me very nicely actually to my second idea on effectiveness. Well, the first thing that Rachel brings to the table is the idea of polarization. And it's fairly simple. When you have to defend your position rather than what is objectively the best position, it is far more likely to lead to extreme discussions or the extreme ends of the spectrum in trying to defend what your interests are rather than what is objectively the best interest of everyone. No response once again from opening government. The second thing Rachel brings to the table is that this leads to poorer representation. The claim coming up from opening government is an idea of mobilization. And we respond to this in a few ways, and this argument also implicitly responds to that. The first way that we respond to this is that what we've done is that mobilization doesn't include everyone in as far as you don't buy into this conception of anger as a prevailing way in which you engage in discourse. The second is that there are other important and essential, I think, non-angry ways in which you can engage or mobilize individuals by just showing them the facts, showing them statistics that they might genuinely not know. Some people genuinely do not know that a large majority of individuals in society today are still starving, are living under the poverty gap and require welfare. They genuinely do not know that welfare programs might not reach into these communities. And I think telling them these facts might actually engage them a lot more than otherwise. But most importantly, Rachel tells you that we prevent prevent those who are loudest from getting into power. Because all they might say in terms of mobilization is outweighed in as far as you're mobilizing them for the wrong cause. When the people who are not genuinely representing the cause come into power simply because they can shout louder, that needs to pour representation on that. Even if you can fight for your cause better, at least on our side, while we might have less people mobilized, we have a more accurate cause that pertains to the needs of individuals. We think that's far more important. The final thing I want to talk about is the thing that you cannot weigh between facts. Like, I think you can. You can objectively weigh between how many poor people are affected by this, how many people are going to lose their jobs, or the economic impacts are. What you cannot weigh out, though, is lived experiences. You cannot say one lived experience is more important than another, because if you are going to do that, you're likely to rile anger in response, it might lead to any kind of violence or any kind of vitriolic response that we don't want on our side. It's far easier to weigh facts, far easier to be more objective, effective, and inclusive. Stand firmly in
I'd like to thank the Deputy Operator for that speech and welcome the Gov member to continue the case for government. Hear, hear.
What we are going to do on closing government is take the opening opposition at their very best and explain to them why it is that we can actually solve polarization via anger, why it is that we can actually have civic society in the first place. Because I think there's a deadlock on the opening half. When they tell you things like, you want more motivation for this political aspect, we want more motivation for this political movement, and these voices and those voices. But the reality is that civic society itself is undergirded by the existence of anger in politics. That without anger, which has an intimate and intrinsic link with things like morality and notions of responsibility, it literally becomes impossible to get the kind of engagement that you have. So I don't want to sound blasé, but literally, some of the bases of things like totalitarianism rely on a notion of dispassionate objective discourse, because you can then be objectively deflationary about notions of things being right and wrong, given the ties between the emotional and the moral. That is what we're going to bring you. The other thing that I'm going to bring you is why it is that anger is the thing that is attributable for the existence of things like institutions and checks and balances in society, because they serve to reveal certain modes of action and show what people can and will do. And so anger in that function allows us to bring to the forefront of discourse what it is that people are capable of, and forces us to provide for those outcomes in the long term, which solves some of the issues that they talk about with regards to polarization, because it literally allows for a functioning civil society rather than the alternative, which might actually be totalitarianism or an approximation thereof. First, a little bit of rebuttal. They say that anger, and when anger is employed in discourse, it is the loudest voice that wins. I think this is severely wrong on at least two counts. Number one, they don't understand the function of anger, which is that it activates competing moral sentiments. It is frequently possible that the reason why you can have meaningful discourse about a policy is that you have anger in both directions, and therefore are forced to interrogate the different forms of anger that you have. So for instance, a policy could be could promise massive social benefits. However, it could also violate individual autonomy. You could be brought to anger about both of these things, but it doesn't mean that the louder one actually works, because what that does is it activates your moral sentiment rather than telling you what the moral sentiment is. Them telling you that the loudest voice is the thing that tells you what to do is incorrect, because the function of anger is to activate a sentiment rather than just to tell you what your feeling needs to be. That was the relevant thing and the relevant function about anger that they don't understand. But the second thing to note is that the reason that they don't get, the reason that the loudest voice doesn't necessarily win is that anger serves the function of allowing people to signal the intensity of their preferences, where in normal discourse, where they want to talk about normal democratic society, this is relatively difficult and perhaps even impossible, right? The way that you voice on their side is you just say, well, we are these people and we have this opinion, and we are this stakeholder. But it becomes very difficult for people who are disparately impacted to have an outside say in what they do. There are meaningful ways for the loudest voice, actually, if you want to take them in their very best case, to be minorities, because they can use the internet, they can use modern forms of discourse that don't ensure that Donald Trump is the loudest voice, that ensure that other people are the loudest voice. So even in their best case, it's not clear why they would, if you do accept this premise that they give you. The other thing they tell you is about polarization, which I think is basically, it's effectively the same thing, right? When they tell you that polarization occurs, the question you need to ask yourself is, why is it true that when you get rid of the sentiment of anger, you are actually going to get rid of, say you get rid of all the polarization in the world, that's still not a good thing, because you could have a system that basically just heaves off responsibility to another actor or another agent, which brings me to the extension. First, I'll actually take opening, if you have one.
Yeah, your claim is that anger activates particular moral sentiments, and that does not mean that loud discourse wins. Opening government's claim, on the contrary, is that individuals are, in general, activated in terms of the moral sentiment when you are loud, and therefore you can convert things like veganism. Is that not intentional?
No, what the opening government told you was that people know that something is objectively true, and then there's a disconnect and there's a gap between what they know to be true and what they want to do. What they don't tell you is how it is that this actually facilitates moral interrogation in the first place and actually coming to these things in the first place. So that's what it does. It forces an interrogation. Okay, let's get to the extension. Number one, why isn't this the case that this is going to lead to people being massively, not just apathetic, but basically heave all of their responsibilities and to feel as though they can offload onto the state and let the state basically do whatever it wants? What does dispassionate objective discourse do? Dispassionate objective discourse forces you to look at your own emotions, look at your own sentiments, and say, that is just a sentiment, that is just something that I feel, rather than being objectively true. And you can basically concoct an explanation for literally anything that you're feeling. You can literally trace the causal chain back and say, I know what it was that caused this. There's no intrinsic reason for me to feel sad, because I just arbitrarily have a disposition to do something versus something else. People can locate in their preferences the reasons why they're upset. Objective discourse forces you to do that. Why is that so bad? Because then what it tells them is it invalidates their own experience, because it tells them that I am just feeling these things for very highly contingent reasons, because I can point those reasons out when I have an individual adaptation of the norm that these guys think is so important. What is the implication? The implication is they look elsewhere for a guide to action. They look elsewhere for a source of authority because they can't locate it in themselves when they're seeking objectivity to that degree. What is the implication? You look to maybe the most powerful actor. So the real severe case of this is offloading onto the state, saying that they can do whatever they want to do, that is the relevant thing that you do. That is the intrinsic feature of an objective discourse, which I think is horrible and doesn't do a good thing. The second point of extension that we want to bring you, though, and why we think this is massively important to resolve the deadlock, is anger functions, when this brings to the fore in discourse, as a means of showing you what the opposition, what other people can and will actually do. The function of this, as I alluded to earlier, is that it forces you to take actions that are possibly preventative of that, to exercise some kind of foresight, given the fact that you know that they might do something very bad because they are angry. On their side, people are still doing this, but there's just post hoc justification, often as sometimes debate judges will do, where they feel a certain way and they concoct a rational explanation, but they're still doing something based on their emotions and their dispositions. At least when you bring anger, when you have anger, it brings people's actual feelings to the forefront, and it shows you that the other side is willing to do literally anything. That forces you to set up institutions. It forces you to set up, for instance, checks and balances. I know that this sounds kind of like a lot, but that is the importance of the norm. That without the norm of anger, without the norm of activating those moral sentiments, there isn't civic society. There isn't that kind of foresight. There is just a deference to another actor, for instance, the state, which completely takes care of this. There's no reason for that. So when they talk about polarization, there is one sense in which they're right. But when you don't have this norm, you have the absolute lack thereof. And the implication of that is that you don't have civic society, you just have the very worst possible outcome, which is no activation of moral sentiments, a moral offloading, and fundamentally no way to have civic society. For those reasons, we are incredibly proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the government member for that speech and welcome the opposition member to continue the case for opposition. Here.
Thank you for the floor. In closing opposition, we're going to talk to you about what uniquely it is about anger, what it draws on, and how it is used that locks individuals out of being able to use it, and why then, secondly, we prefer a comparative of dispassionate objectivity, why that is more accessible and ultimately more productive. One quick response to the closing government extension before I go on. They say that their main harm is that people will just offload to the state because they don't feel like they have enough information to say that something is objectively true, whereas a politician or someone engaging in it might. I think when they're talking about what it is, like public policy that will affect what it is to be a single mother, what it is to be a minority in a country, when a government tells you what the objective truth is, you have lived enough days, you have talked to enough people, you have suffered enough things to know that maybe that's not wrong and just immediately discount how you have felt all your life. I think saying that something is objective, you still hold your own truths to be true, and you are likely, if someone says something that you don't find to be true, to still question that and say, no, that's not right, but I believe, I have a reason to believe that my objective truth is something that you should take as credible and you should take as important. So we still get engagement on our side of the house. What does anger draw on and how is it used? There's two main areas in this, because why does the ability to utilize anger to affect change always reside with people who are powerful? This takes down opening government. Because how seriously you take someone's anger is directly proportional to the amount of damage that individual could do with that power. That is why people take Donald Trump's angry tweets very seriously, because he has the nuclear codes. However, you mightn't take my anger as seriously, because the worst thing I could do is punch Ashing in the face, and I probably wouldn't even hurt her that much. But what you mean is that the amount of damage you could do is directly proportional to the amount of privilege that you have. So in a world where everyone uses anger, the individual who owns the company that employs most of the people in my town has more ability to affect change with their anger and damage with their anger than maybe the workers who are criticizing the way that they are treating them, because they know that if that individual is really angry about something, they could pull out of that town, they could cease to support you and cease to be employing individuals within that town. That can only happen, and the seriousness with which people treat your anger and the statements you make through anger is directly proportional to the amount of damage you could do with it. That is why it is linked back to the amount of privilege individuals have in the first place. That is why powerless people and minorities are systematically kept out of using anger as an effective tool. But secondly, OG say there are reasons why people are locked out of power but not out of anger. Crucially, we have to look here at the interaction of gender and anger, because angry men are seen as powerful, as passionate, as dominant, and angry women are seen as hysteric and uncontrolled and a loose cannon. It is not true to say that everyone using this will be perceived in the same way. Anger will be particularly poorly done. I think women will come out particularly poorly if a norm is created where they are forced to engage in public discourse, use anger, because the likelihood that people will view those sentiments and the things that they say through anger the same way that they view men is less. So the comparative power of women to contribute to public discourse is diminished when the norm becomes you have to use anger as opposed to using your own qualifications, your personal experiences. I will talk about that later. I know it's fair to say that there are still issues in a world where you have to use dispassionate objectivity to talk about women's issues, that women might be listened to less than other individuals, but I think that I'll talk about why it's comparatively better. Even in comparison to status quo, this is an additional harm where women are particularly viewed, no thank you, as being erratic. This means that we have proved this analysis of minorities or power through anger being locked in the hands of people who have power already, and also how gender interacts with anger. Why the outcome of the people who are affected most by the outcome of public discourse are less able to use anger than they would like you to believe, and I'm going to talk to you about why a comparative is better. But before I go on, I'll take closing.
The reason why we generally consider Angela Davis to be a better feminist than Sheryl Sandberg is precisely because she uses anger, that she's better able to affect change and change the general views of whether or not anger is an acceptable tool for women to use.
No, that's not true. It's also because of some of Sheryl Sandberg's views. But when like a woman gets angry, they can see her as being uncontrolled and like emotional. It plays into the idea that you can't put a woman in a position of power because who knows if she has the codes to know she's so emotional, erratic, and probably on a period she'll just go crazy. That feeds into it on the idea where you have to use anger more. So why is dispassionate objectivity better? There are numerous reasons. The first, there's an emphasis on content rather than emotional response. You are likely to get ahead in a world where this public discourse is happening from development of ideas, so they develop to reach more people rather than they develop to enrage more people so that more people support you. That means they're likely to become more deep and more nuanced and therefore better policy. Secondly, objectivity attempts to preemptively include people. It attempts to acknowledge that something could affect multiple groups in different ways. Anger doesn't do this because you can't be equally angry about one thing and then equally angry on the other side and present that from one person. Closing government say you can, but the likelihood is the first one you see and the first one you have an emotional gut reaction to is probably what you'll continue to feel because you strongly associate with those emotions rather than facts, and so that flexibility is unlikely. OO say this leads to better compromise, but we think it has two more important impacts. Firstly, people don't shut themselves out of politics from the start because politics is likely to have aimed and discourse is likely to have aimed to include them when they attempt to be objective from the start. So they haven't already decided that public discourse isn't something that could benefit them, isn't something that they could ever engage with. But secondly, it's less coercive because you're not emphasizing an emotional reaction that people can't ignore to try and force them to believe your thing, but it's trying to provide information that will enable people to make their own minds up. We think that public discourse that is less coercive is better. Thirdly, for minorities and women, while they might be less powerful in particular ways, it doesn't mean they're less qualified to talk on a topic necessarily because they might have a degree in it or some certain of lived experience that is viewed as important. But systematically, these individuals have less power to stoke fear and fearmonger because they have less access to resources that the threat that they could follow through on that fear, because people only take fear seriously if they believe you could follow through on it or if you could threaten them in some particular way. Fourthly and finally, you get better outcomes with respect to blame and accountability. Because when you have a public discourse that is based on anger, you tend to have trial by mob, a demonization that doesn't try to get you to understand the nuances of a situation, but to have an emotional reaction to a non-emotional situation, like an emotional reaction to an email that was sent in the case of Hillary Clinton. We think that is where you don't get a search for objectivity and understanding of what happened and a thorough investigation of who needs to be held accountable and who is to blame. That's when you get people being able to get away with things in public discourse when they know that they can rely on emotion and stoking fear rather than the facts and objectivity. Please close.
I'd like to thank the op member for that speech and welcome the government whip to conclude the Gov case here.
The end of the opening half was quite dispiriting, because if the arguments that we heard were true, we're all doomed. Because if we live in a world where the norm is just anger, everyone's super hyped up to be able to affect change, but you never get anything done, because you get this very polarized society where everyone demonizes one another or trial by mob, you pick whatever noun that we heard up and down their bench. But if we believe what they're saying is true, that we should have objectivity, maybe we have very polite discourse where maybe things can pass, we're not necessarily passing the right measures because no one is actually motivated to do things. What you end up getting on both sides, if you listen just to the other three sides in the round, is literally nothing actually happening. Either you're stopped by polarization or you're going to be stopped because no one's motivated to act. The only side that actually tells you how literally anything changes is going to be from the closing government, where it explains that what anger does is it creates not just a motivation to actually act, but also a fear about the anger that other people are going to do. Which is why you set up institutions to be able to actually pass things, because you're scared of what the other side is going to do. And on an objective society, we also explain why it is that it isn't going to actually pass things, because people just defer to others. Let's break it down to the two cases. What does the world look like when we have a world of anger? What does it look like when we have a world of objectivity? First, let's talk about the world of anger. First argument we hear of why this potentially might be bad is no one's going to be convinced if you just yell in their face. This is just simply not the case. You don't have to personally attack someone to be angry. For example, I convinced the Prime Minister to become vegetarian. I didn't say this by literally saying, you are a horrible person if you eat meat, rather just explaining why it is terrible that the scale of moral suffering that eating actually entails. It's super easy to actually be able to convince people with anger without personally attacking people. Second off, they would hear the argument up and down the bench in various forms of development that people with the most power can always create the most damage, and that is always going to have some asymmetric issue with anger. The problem is this isn't a feature of anger, this is a feature just of literal power structures. If you have an objective society, what you have is just polite society, the people who engage in objective discourse are typically going to be like the old white men. This is what we saw, think of like the Royal Society people in 19th century Britain. I think it's just a factor of power structures, not a factor of anger specifically.
Third, we see this argument that I think is quite clever, that anger is typically seen as a masculine trait, and that's going to have disparate impacts on power. A couple of things on this. First off, there's a certain extent to which this argument is circular, that if we change the norm so that anger is a general discourse in society, that this might also trickle down. But second off, I think we can generally change this norm over the long run if we can actually have this norm be in place. Moreover, I think that one of the that we can actually affect change even if people think that women are likely to shouldn't be expressing anger. Why? Because I think on the average person society generally considers themselves to be respectful for women, even if their actually actions and their mindset doesn't follow. Their self-image is someone who that they are respectful. So when someone goes up there and extremely angrily says that what you're doing is extremely offensive to me and very damaging to them, they might have a personal beef with that person, but they still are more likely to change their actual behavior because their self-image as someone who's respectful is no longer in alignment with what they're seeing in the real world. You don't have the type of discontinuity between their self-image and what they're actually doing when people just engage in polite discourse because they never actually have to feel uncomfortable about themselves. The best argument and the best reason why an angerful society might actually not work is because it just leads to polarization, demonization, trial by mob, etc. This is the reason why we all take it over the entirety of opening half and also, I think, closing opposition. Because we explain how even in the spite of this anger, we can still actually affect some sort of change, which is by setting up institutions. Broadly speaking, the reason why institutions flourish is that people are scared of the other side. They see an angry mob and say, what would happen if they got power? Maybe I should create norms to say that you can't just impeach every single Supreme Court justice. You create norms that have separation of powers so that you can check back against impeachment of the executive. The argument here is not something that's super far-fetched. We're not saying you're going to necessarily descend into totalitarianism, but there are obvious gradations of democratic health. We see that South African democratic health is probably less democratic than Italy, which is somewhat less healthy than Britain or somewhat less healthy than Sweden. The fact of the matter is that when you have these type of very these type of norms, what happens is that you can be able to set up these type of checks and balances. We can get actual measures passed on our side of the house simply because you lead to a better equilibrium where people are more likely to cooperate precisely because they have their fear of the other side. That's why I think we take it over our opening and also take up their objection. Yeah, what's up?
Yeah, if I feel strongly that I need welfare, I will lobby the state to give me that welfare, enact whatever checks and balances you want, logically without anger. Why would I dismiss this feeling and offload or defer responsibility to the precise state which has failed me?
Yeah, so the reason why is twofold, which is a good transition to this argument of objectivity. First off, Sinan points out that if you try to thoroughly inspect your beliefs, which is the best case that we get from the opposition bent, it's generally rooted in something that is just purely seen often as unobjective, that maybe I'm not deserving of this, or they just seem to, if you go back down, and eventually it's based on some intuition that we cannot explain. This is the idea of a first principle that is not rooted in everything else, which is why they're likely to see it as arbitrary. Second off, if you're purely objective, it's actually highly rational to not question the beliefs of others. Because when you think about it, if you're a perfect Bayesian, that if everyone else disagrees with you and isn't providing you with these type of things, maybe they're more likely to be correct as some sort of wisdom of the crowd, which is a fairly strong reason to believe why it is that people aren't going to interrogate particular systems. Moreover, people are going to have a lot more confidence that the government is able to regulate things, that you don't need to defer to the collective wisdom if an objective truth exists. Because I think one of the reasons why we're willing to accept decentralized power in many ways, or that's just even like a market system, is in large part because we recognize that when we believe that not everything is objective that is out there, that one person, even if they had all the information, can't actually solve something. We think that faith is you shouldn't have the faith that one person can solve it. But that's not true when the type of norm is out there that we can just interrogate things objectively. That one person, if they had the information, could actually be able to solve these problems. So, why could it possibly be true that objectivity is great? Because I think one of the biggest problems with OO particularly is their lack of defense of objectivity and their greater focus on just criticizing the anger that we heard from the Prime Minister and the DPM, I guess. So, first off, we hear that, look, people are still going to hold their own views to be true, even if you're under an objective society. We explain why that isn't the case. That if you're purely objective, you're more likely to defer to others because of some sort of deference to wisdom of the crowds. But the better argument is here that maybe you get more interrogation of your own beliefs if you're trying to be objective, because that's what like an objective discourse is actually about. First off, you don't actually have an incentive to interrogate your own belief, to the extent that it's much more objective and much more rational to defer to others, and moreover, insofar as your marginal impact on public discourse isn't likely to be particularly large, there's no incentive for you to actually do it if you're highly objective.
Second off, even to the extent that in the short term, that no one acts like that anger, you just defer to your actual beliefs, right? That as we hear from closing, that basically you just go with what your first pass instinct is. That might make you make the wrong decision in the short term. But I'm totally fine if you make a decision right now, and then a week later you have a different emotional feeling, and you decide better. Because people generally don't change the entire country over the course of a week. We're the only ones who show how change actually happens, which is why we're so proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the government whip for that speech and welcome the opposition whip to conclude the op case and indeed this debate.
Two things in this speech: how we make politics and general conversation about social issues more accessible, and second of all, why specifically anger is so harmful, what is unique about it. But before I do, I just want to clear up something, right? In terms of burdens in this debate, opposition does not have to stand over status quo, because the debate is realistically about a norm that says either that you use anger as anger is embraced in public discourse, or dispassionate objectivity is embraced, or the thing that public discourse tends towards, right? They never prove like systematically why that is the case in status quo. Insofar as they give examples of people like Trump and people who use anger in status quo, we think that the reality is opposition is not status quo. So let's just talk about accessibility first. First part of this responds directly to closing government, right? Because their extension is that this is about responsibility. And they say that what happens is that people offload things onto the state because it is about objectivity, and that creates less institutional accountability. Aisling responds to this, and it was largely ignored in the whip speech, right? Because she says, first of all, that in order to achieve objective truth, everyone has to contribute, right? Because objective truth is combined experience, right? So you can contribute to a reality or a realization of objective truth, which means that you were invited and encouraged to contribute your opinion. If your opinion is contrary to the objective truth that is come to you, and you have not contributed before that point, then you probably do contribute at that point, right? Because you don't agree with that truth, and therefore you are more likely to campaign, lobby, whatever it is, complain about the fact that the objective truth was not met. But Aisling explains to you that in a world where dispassionate objectivity is the priority, you are more likely to have more inclusion in the process in the first place, right? So a committee that wants to find an objective truth in a particular issue is more likely to talk to loads of people who are affected by that issue. That means you're more likely to see the inclusion of these minority voices in the first place. That means opening government's point about slow politics happen is actually not true. Insofar as the status quo is, you have to accept the majority opinion, even if that's racist, even if that's the party that you never vote for, even if that is all partisan and never seek to include you in the first place. The comparative is that you're more likely to see inclusive policy that people feel like actually have a voice in, right? So minorities will systematically be not communicated with on their side of the house in a world where there is polarized or partisan politics. On our side of the house, you're more likely to tend towards including people in all conversations. Then closing government say, no, genuinely, nothing happens in your world. Here's the response to this, right? We still need things from government. People still need education, they still need protection, they still need things to happen in the world we live in. They still wake up one day and someone says something horrible to them and they want to fix it in some capacity, right? Insofar as there is still suffering in the world, things are still happening, is what we would contend on opposition. We don't think that's too big a thing to claim. But importantly, this process is going to more likely to happen and include people from day one, insofar as it is a search for objective truth. Important thing to note, lots of people think they know the objective truth. I'm sure everyone in this room thinks they know an objective truth on some particular situation or something that has happened in their life. Academic writers write all the time about what they think is an objective truth, as do journalists, as do researchers. Genuinely, there are so many colliding opinions in this world that claim to be objective truth. The reality of this debate is that when you have those colliding opinions of objective truth, in dispassionate objectivity, you are more likely to have a conversation that leads those two things together than on their side of the house, where one person says, no, ours is the objective truth, you are the enemy, and the other says, no, ours is the objective truth, you are the enemy, and don't deserve to be listened to. But so that's the pursuit of truth. But finally, in relation to fence voters, because Aisling responds to this, but I just want to make sure this is clearly heard. They tell you, opening government, that on their side of the house, you use anger and passion to convince people that you are right. On our side of the house, you use facts to convince people are right. Why is ours better? Because anger and passion stirs something in someone that they did not originally feel, right? So you don't look for their opinion, you try to change their mind. We think that is a coercive sense of politics that doesn't tend towards natural opinions or natural personal experiences of things, but rather tries to force one on someone or make them feel angry about it. Especially in a world where so many people get away with lying, and so many media resources and politicians get away with tainting truths and making statistics look disfavourable. We would prefer a world where natural opinions of people were prioritised. We think that insofar as on their side of the house, anger aims to coerce people to believe something that is not preferable to a world where we try to achieve truth through asking people and communicating with people how they feel. Even if we don't ask them though, we do have to take on their opinion when we haven't asked them and they disagree with what has happened, and therefore you have more general contribution, more checks and balances, more accountability, and more accessibility. So let's talk about what's unique about anger, right? Because open and government tell you that objectivity is formed by privileged people. And they tell you that in the world that we live in, we need to create a world where everyone has the capacity through anger to make change. Opening opposition say like, oh no, these people can't get heard. Ashley tells you that the reality is not that they can't get heard. The reality is that your capacity to encourage someone to act in a way based on your anger is proportionate to how much power you have, how much pain you can cause that person, how serious they're going to take you, how likely they are to respond to your particular claim, whether they care about you in the first place, whether they feel like you could pose a legitimate threat, right? So if they already think they're in the majority, they have no incentive to listen to you because they're going to get their way. There is no incentive for them to cooperate when they're like, oh well, 50% of this 60% of our population is white, so why would I bother listening to somebody who has a different experience to me when it's more likely that I relate to these people and I don't have an incentive or interest in cooperating with these people, especially if they are angry at me and oppositional to my personal views. That means that actually what happens is you are more likely to get people being shut out of politics for those particular reasons. No. The problem with this is that those are the people that opening government's poverty they want to overthrow, right? Those are the people who closing government wants to create systems of accountability to. Yeah, opening go.
The reason the norms matter is because they disproportionately shut down the anger of victims who are not socially secure, like the powerful. How do you get the mass turnout of victims you need to get reform if they don't think their anger and their experiences are legitimate?
The problem is that they don't create a world where that anger is taken more seriously. They just create a world where that anger is the only way those people can create change, right? So they can't do it dispassionately and objectively. They can't come up with their sheet of facts that has been conferred by hundreds of people or thousands of people or millions of people. They just confirm it based on anger, and they never explain to you why women's anger is taken more seriously, or why people who are not rich or people who don't have access to political or economic capital's anger is taken less seriously. So here's the thing, right? OG say that that the people, it will be normal, so it won't be shamed. They can't caveat into the norm what's normal, right? If the most normal thing in the world is that powerful men are angry and can cause more pain, that is also the norm on their side of the house, right? So they can't caveat out that harm on their side of the house. Yeah, so you don't remove racial resentment, you don't remove sexist platforms, you make it harder for those people to shut down barriers, you make it harder to create accountability, and you generally polarize and make systems more partisan. That makes it harder for us to achieve objective truth, and it makes it harder to engage people. Please propose.